So what's going on in Russian aviation? Are things over there collapsing as I predicted a year ago, or have they returned to business as usual after figuring out ways to work around the Western sanctions? Well, today I'm going to have a look at some new developments around those aircraft that Russia took over, and we'll also have a further look at the effects that this situation is having on aviation, both inside and outside of Russia. Stay tuned. It has now been 2.5 years since Russia's rapid escalation of its attack on Ukraine, and the invasion obviously led to strong reactions by a majority of the West, with many imposing strong sanctions as a result.
Massive and targeted sanctions.
This included actions towards the country's airline industry, and among other things, it had as an effect that lesser-owned aircraft in Russia were effectively stolen by the airlines who operated them. So, how is that going then? Well, in June this year, the world of aviation saw an escalation of a pretty unusual standoff, but not the military one this time. Instead, the battle stood between multiple aircraft leasing companies and their insurers. It took place in Ireland and was one of many such legal cases around the world involving aircraft that the Russian airlines had refused to return to their owners. But what exactly made this trial unusual, you might ask? Well, how about the fact that the Irish court authorities had to set up a temporary makeshift court to make it possible to even hear this case? The reason for that was that this was the biggest ever legal case to be heard in Ireland, at least in terms of the number of lawyers present. Up to 180 lawyers was and is able to attend these hearings every day, with even more of them sometimes taking part via video links. Now, the reason for these hordes of lawyers is that this case involved half a dozen lessors, over a dozen insurers, contracted by the lessors themselves, and possibly a lot more insurers based in Russia, contracted by Russian airlines. So, that's a lot of lawyers, meaning that this case might take around 7 months to reach its conclusion. Now, the stakes are obviously quite high, about 2.5 billion euros or 2.7 billion US dollars, and that only covers about 80 of the over 400 Western aircraft that were stranded in Russia when the sanctions first started. The reason this trial is taking place in Ireland is because most of the world's biggest aircraft lessors are based there, but this isn't the only such trial currently in the works. Other lessors, including AerCap, who's the biggest lessor in the world, is holding a separate trial in the UK. And that one will start next October, with more leasing companies pursuing their insurance claims elsewhere, including in the United States. Now, if you think that I'm going to analyze the legal arguments of the many sides in this court standoff, well, that won't happen. Not since this case requires 180 lawyers to argue, but we can have at least a little look at some of the arguments that are being thrown around. Obviously, the leasing companies are unable to get their planes back from Russia, which is why they're demanding a payout from their insurers. But from the insurers' side, a lot of them are saying that there hasn't actually been a physical loss of an aircraft yet, in this case. They are arguing that maybe some of these aircraft can still be repossessed and therefore returned. Or another strategy that they're pursuing is that it was actually the lessors who decided to end the leasing agreement in the first place. In the end though, this might come down to whose actions actually caused the problem in the first place. Was it the Russians and their escalating invasion of Ukraine, or was it the Western governments who actually imposed the sanctions? Or was it the lessors and the way that they reacted to all of this, and also, are the stock jets subject to a war risk or a broader all-risk insurance policy? The leasing companies are accusing the insurance companies of not being able to agree on the meaning of their own policies, while the insurers accuse the lessors of not being sure of when the loss of the aircraft actually happened. Again, that's the fight over 80 jets and around $2.7 billion in Ireland and even more in the UK. But meanwhile, several lessors have instead made settlements with Russia for some of the aircraft that are stuck there. Typically, they've done that through Russian insurers, who has then paid and passed on the ownership of those aircraft to the Russian airlines. The exact number of these planes are unclear, because not all of the terms of these agreements are public, but it's probably over 100, with a value of, again, around $2.7 billion. But since the total number of aircraft that got stuck there was around 400, that means that even if the court cases in Ireland and the UK are concluded, over half of the aircraft originally leased to Russian airlines remain technically stolen. But planes are not just stuck in Russia. Others also got stuck inside of Ukraine when the Russians invaded. Now, a couple of those had since managed to fly out of there, but as I record this, 29 of them are still stuck, and obviously Ukraine's airspace remains completely closed for now. A number of those aircraft were also leased, and recently there was another court case in London about those, but it didn't go anywhere. The judge presiding over that court case ruled that unlike the ownership disputes of the stolen jets, the cases of the planes that were stuck in Ukraine should be heard by courts in Ukraine. That was not what the leasing companies who owns those aircraft wanted to hear. Because obviously the people of Ukraine continues to have far more serious and urgent things to worry about than the arguments of lawyers regarding aircraft lessors and insurers. So what that really means is that any decisions on the fate of those airliners will have to wait for a while yet. But on a broader level, a good news story for the industry is that despite the lawyer standoffs, leasing companies and insurers don't appear to be in any immediate financial trouble because of this. During the early stages of this ugly situation, some industry insiders feared that this would cause a collapse of the whole leasing industry, which in turn would create huge problems for the entire world of commercial aviation, since over half of the world's airliners belong to those leasing companies. But that, happily, doesn't seem to be the case. Anyway, that's all about the effects of Russia's invasion outside of Russia. But how about the developments inside of Russia itself? Well, that comes after this. With geopolitical tensions affecting the aviation industry, there's now an increasing need to really understand aviation data and predictions. And that's why I am so proud to tell you about today's sponsor, Brilliant, and the new course Predicting with Probability. Now, Brilliant is my own all-time favorite learning platform, and it's perfect for anyone looking to hone their skills in STEM subjects like data analysis, math, programming, physics, and AI. The platform can be used by anyone at any age, so it's a great way to keep your own and your children's brains active and curious over the summer holidays. And the course that I just mentioned, Predicting with Probability, provides hands-on experience extracting predictions about the future of weather and airline data. This means that if you try it out, you will learn how to work with probability mass functions, joint and conditional probabilities, as well as the Bayes theorem. So, if you want to become a better thinker, improve your STEM skills and have fun while you do, go to brilliant.org/mentor now. This will give you 30 days completely free access to Brilliant to try it out, and then a 20% discount on their annual subscription, which is truly awesome. I love being able to provide discounts on products who truly improve people's lives, and Brilliant is definitely one of them. Thank you, Brilliant. Now let's continue. In April last year, Aeroflot announced that they had decided to send one of their Airbus A330s to Iran for maintenance work. That aircraft was then flown to Tehran, where the Iranian carrier Mahan Air has its repair base, and it now seems that this was done as kind of a trial step. Aeroflot wanted the Iranian company to service the landing gear struts of this Airbus A330, and it later emerged that Aeroflot wasn't really satisfied with the job, but I'll get back to that soon. Since then, we've also seen more news coming out of Russia and its airline fleet, and one of those is that Western countries continue to impose new sanctions on Russian airlines and entities. These new sanctions are primarily aimed at Russian entities who have played an active role in the war against Ukraine by either moving people or material. Companies included are, for example, the cargo operator Volga-Dnepr, who operates a fleet of Antonov AN-124 freighters, as well as Ural Airlines, an all-Airbus narrow-body airline, which I actually just featured over on the Mentor Pilot channel. You should definitely check that out. The airport management company Novaport Holding has also been sanctioned by the European Union because some of the 23 airports it operates have a joint civilian and military role. That said, how much these new sanctions will actually impact beyond the sanctions already in place is a little bit up for debate. But other, broader sanctions are aimed at limiting Russia's access to technology that could have a military purpose. And a lot of that type of technology also have some overlap with commercial aviation. Otherwise, a lot of the news regarding aircraft operations in Russia seems to be quite positive, especially if you're a Russian airline boss. If you're a crew or a passenger, well then things gets a little bit more complicated, so let's have a little bit of a look at that. The main good news story for Russian airlines is that the total number of flight hours of their fleet have now recovered to pre-2022 levels, which is surprising considering that they have no access to official channels for aircraft spare parts. In a recent statement, Airbus confirmed that there is no legal way that genuine aircraft parts, documentation or services can get to Russian carriers. So the fact that Russian airlines can operate Western planes under these conditions is quite impressive. Especially when we consider that before 2022, Aeroflot and many of its subsidiaries relied on maintenance and repair centers in Germany and Hong Kong. Bear in mind that even though China hasn't imposed any direct sanctions on Russia, its maintenance centers still stop servicing all Russian aircraft for fear of suffering sanctions themselves and therefore losing access to Boeing and Airbus parts. So how are the Russian airlines actually doing this? Well, the quick answer is with money. A crazy amount of money. And to understand that, let's go back to Iran for a moment. You see, the possibility of getting maintenance done for its planes in Iran was only one of the ideas that Aeroflot and other Russian carriers were exploring. Another idea, a much more promising one for the long run, has to do with figuring out how Iran has been maintaining and operating its own fleet of aircraft and then just copying that. You see, Iran has been under international sanctions for a very long time by now, but this doesn't mean that they haven't been able to source parts for their aircraft. How? Well, a recent Financial Times article explored this part smuggling operation quite thoroughly. And in essence, it involves a variety of relatively small companies, many of them based in the United Arab Emirates, but also in China, the Maldives and Turkey. That's not entirely surprising. A few months ago, I made a video looking at how Aeroflot was able to operate several of their aircraft with one inoperative brake while they were waiting for more parts to come. And now we know from where those parts are coming. You see, these companies have specialized in, let's say, repackaging vital aircraft components and then shipping them around the world in very creative ways. For example, Russia's S-7, also known as Siberian Airlines, has recently been getting shipments of Air Data Inertial Reference Units, or ADIRUs, packed inside passenger luggage. We know about this because these items, 11 of them in total, appeared in a customs report in Moscow's Vnukovo airport, and each ADIRU apparently weighed 11 kilos, so they had to be shipped separately. Now, in the case of Iran, it turns out that these companies have been able to sometimes transport and sell more than just aircraft components. Think more entire airplanes. Yeah, back in 2016, a UAE-based company called Turboshaft FZE suddenly bought two Airbus A340s from the government of Greece. These jets had previously belonged to Olympic Airways, but they were then taken out of service and parked in Athens for over 7 years. Eventually, the Greek state, which the aircraft belonged to at the time, sold them to Turboshaft basically as scrap. But the company somehow managed to get them airworthy, and in February 2017, the two jets took off, supposedly on flights over to Kazakhstan, where they were supposed to join the fleet of Beek Air. Now, that's an airline whose name has already been implicated in a number of suspicious deals before the company finally folded back in 2018. But in any case, the two Airbus A340s never got to their intended destinations. Because as they were flying over Iran, they suddenly ended up diverting to Tehran instead. One of them was later sold on to Syrian Air, and the other one still flies for Iran's Mahan Air to this day, so I guess that's one way of doing it. More recently, Iran also got 4 more Airbus A340s in more or less the same way, and this time they were ex-Turkish Airlines aircraft flying from South Africa. And last February they got 2 more from Lithuania. Now, tricks like that might work for Iran, but Russia's aviation industry is many times larger and can't really be served by 1 or 2 old unwanted Airbus A340s every once in a while. Although some similar sounding stories are actually starting to come out of Russia too. Recently, a brand new Airbus A320neo that was bought before the 2022 sanctions as a private jet somehow made its way into Russia after first changing registration multiple times. But remember that company, Turboshaft FZE, who acquired the first 2 of those Airbus A340s for Iran? Well, turns out that that's the same company that packaged those 11 ADIRUs in suitcases and then shipped them to Russia's Siberian Airlines. This company actually have a quite interesting history. They are owned by Russian nationals, and when they first started doing business over a decade ago, they specialized in selling used parts for old Soviet aircraft from Russia and then shipped those parts to all over the world. So you could say that the Russia-Ukraine war and the sanctions that then followed made this and also some other similar companies reverse the flow of parts and also greatly increase the volume of their operations. But this is where this story starts to get a little bit ugly. First of all, as I've pointed out in multiple previous videos, whenever you are dealing with parts from shady sources, you don't actually know what you are getting. Parts don't have to be complete fakes to be dangerous. They could also be components that were made by proper manufacturers, but which have already reached their flight hour limits or other limits and should therefore be scrapped. There are international safeguards that today allow companies to track aircraft parts, but when your parts arrive repackaged in suitcases, do you really know their provenance and do you trust the paperwork that they come with? When Turboshaft was still selling old Soviet aircraft components, some of their customers weren't always really happy with the quality of those parts. So new customers should probably keep a healthy amount of skepticism as well here. To summarize, if Russia starts copying Iran's way of getting aircraft parts, well then they need to be very careful to not also start copying Iran's aviation safety record. Second, getting anything from the black market source generally involves a substantial markup. Whatever it is, it will be more expensive than if it had come from the right source, and as it turns out, aircraft parts are no exception to this. And that's where we start getting into the crazy amount of money bit of this story. Figuring out the average markup for parts is difficult without knowing the conditions of those parts, or if those values declared to customers are even real or not. But it looks like Russian airlines are buying some of these suitcase-packed ADIRUs for $120,000 each, which is a 100% markup on the legal parts who normally sell for around $50,000 to $70,000. And traffic collision and avoidance systems, or TCAS, are also selling in Russia for over 100,000 American dollars instead of the normal 15,000 to 25,000. The only good news in this affair for the Russian airlines is that they might not have to foot the bill themselves for these price hikes. You see, just weeks after the imposition of Western sanctions, the Russian state set aside 2.5 billion euros, or about $2.7 billion, specifically for sanction-related additional expenses. And while some of this money was sent to buy Western aircraft from lessors, not all of it was. So when you put all of these factors together, you can maybe see how Russia's aviation industry has been able to limp back to its pre-war number of flight hours. But it's not clear if all Russian airlines are actually getting access to these shady parts we're talking about. And what do I mean by that? Well, an indication might be that after the crew of a Ural Airlines Airbus A320 made an emergency landing in a muddy field in Siberia recently, the airline seriously considered flying it out from that same muddy field. In the end, it looks like those plans were abandoned because the field didn't get hard enough during the winter, but seriously considering such a rescue plan probably wouldn't have been done if normal sources of aircraft and parts were still available. Other reports indicate that airlines in Russia are now no longer needing to rely on their supply of spare engines, many of whom actually also belong to lessors, by the way. Now instead, the airlines are slowly getting the ability to service and repair their engines themselves and then put them back into service. But one fact is impossible to get around. Even with these alternative parts suppliers and the homemade engine service centers, Russia's airlines are now having to make do as best as they can with a lot fewer components coming into the country than it did before. And I mean a lot fewer. Before 2022, Siberian Airlines was reportedly importing around $100 million worth of aircraft spare parts per month. And today, that number is under 20 million. And we don't even know if those 20 millions includes the obligatory markup that their new friendly smugglers are asking for. So as you can imagine, flying aircraft for the same amount of hours, but with only a fraction of the regular amount of spare parts, has some disturbing implications. For example, there are now some reports that filters for the Sukhoi Superjet, who are made in France and should be replaced whenever they become clogged, are now instead being removed, cleaned and then reused by the Russian owner Airlines. Now that story didn't specify what type of filters that they're talking about, but I really hope that they're not fuel filters. You see, the core of the Powerjet's SAM 146 engine for the Superjet is made in France by Safran, so it's not impossible that it is those filters that they're actually talking about. Anyway, Rusavitsia, Russia's aviation authority, has also been handing out approvals for more and more Russian companies to allow them to start making copies of Western aircraft components. And at the same time, Rusavitsia has also stopped publishing detailed information on the airlines that it's monitoring, including the number of each aircraft type that these airlines are operating. And that's not really a move that inspires a lot of confidence. Finally, perhaps the most telling development about the state of Russia's aviation is that 2.5 years after the sanctions, there is no real news regarding new Russian aircraft development and production. From what we heard in 2022 and 2023, Russia's long-term solution for replacing those Western jets was to build hundreds of fully Russian superjets, MC-21s, and perhaps even some Tupolev Tu-214s. But the superjet and the MC-21 both rely on Western parts for avionics and, well, just about everything else apart from the airframe. So replacing all of those parts with Russian ones would amount to a complete redesign of the aircraft, as I've also explained in previous videos. In the end, this is all academic though, because despite bold statements about the rebirth of the Russian aircraft manufacturing industry, it seems that the companies there are more focused on figuring out ways to continue using Western aircraft, rather than building new ones themselves, but that obviously can't go on forever. Russian operators obviously know that. Even with their experience in engine repairs and part swaps, Russian maintenance centers just don't have the necessary infrastructure to perform heavy maintenance on their Boeings and Airbuses. Without that ability, all of the suitcase parts in the world won't keep those planes in service for more than a few years, which means that fully Russified versions of those Russian jets need to be certified and in production by then. But what do you think? What will Russia's commercial aviation look like in another year? Let me know in the comments below. Now, my team and I spend loads of time painstakingly researching and making these videos, and if you like what we do and want to support it, the best way of doing that is by joining my Patreon crew by clicking on the links here below. We have regular Zoom hangouts together, they get to preview my content and really take part in the work that we do, so I would love to see you there. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.